Well, today we're going to talk about Elvis Presley. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. This channel is for everybody who hasn't seen Elvis Presley before or hasn't listened to his music. It's kind of hard to ignore or say you haven't seen his picture, because I know you have. If you've been alive in America for more than 3 or 4 years, you know you've heard of Elvis Presley. Now, the fact you haven't heard his music, that's just a shame. This channel is mostly for classic rock, and Elvis really doesn't fit into that category, but he is the influence by which all rock and rollers that followed him are measure themselves, shall we say. Just so you'll know, I'm not the real Elvis. I'm just one of his helpers, because let's face it, he can't be at every mall at one time. The man could wear a pompadour far better than I, and I tell you what, he must have gone through a lot of gel or whatever kind of product he used, because this stuff doesn't stay up very easy. Before we go any further, I want you to like and subscribe. It's not hard. You know I told you that before, and it is not going to hurt you. It's going to help me. So if you want me to hurry up and get off doing this kind of stuff, let's get through the whole series. So subscribe. We'll make a bunch of money, or I'll make a bunch of money off of ads and stuff. All you got to do is watch and subscribe and like. Do it. Elvis Presley, known as the king of rock and roll. I am very hesitant to use words of royalty for Americans like king. After all, we did fight a war 250 years ago to get away from that kind of crap. But be that what it may, rock and roll king was and is and always will be Elvis Presley. Why? Well, he didn't invent it. There's plenty of people that were playing rock and roll before him that would like to take the credit, or at least take the title. But because he brought it to the masses, he brought it to everybody, whether it was the controversy that he caused, whether it was the culture change that he introduced, and you know, on purpose or not, he did. He really brought a culture shift to America. Before Elvis, most people went on stage and they stood pretty still. Some black artists were a little more active on stage, and that was looked down upon, well, at least by white folks at the time. It was a time, and we're talking about 1954 when Elvis really started, and at that time it was very, very prejudiced country, kind of like today, except it was more open, and people would get in your face about really, really nasty, dirty things they could say and think. Elvis Presley came from the South. He was exposed to that, but he didn't play white music. He played what was considered black music. It was inspired by blues, but I think his style had more of a country flavor to it. His style was, or his genre was initially rockabilly. If you haven't listened to rockabilly, it's a fun genre. But other than that, rock and roll, pop, and gospel. He sang a lot of gospel in the 60s and kept a lot of his fan base that he had made in the 50s, who were, getting a little tired of the hippie movement and the other societal changes that, let's face it, Elvis had something to do with, but they did like his gospel music. They liked seeing that cute face of his. So Elvis was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. Where's that? It's near One Below. My apologies to Richard Pryor. If there's one thing I consistently mention on this channel, is that rock and roll is primarily about sex. And one of the main reasons that Elvis was so controversial was his sex appeal. In 1950s America, people were terrified of sex. Up until that point, you didn't have the pill, and I forget what year it came out, but it was during the 50s, and the idea of having sex without having kids or without getting married beforehand was a new concept, and something Americans weren't really embracing at the time. But then this guy Elvis, he was full of sex appeal, talking about he had good looks, he was young, he knew how to move, he could sing. men wanted to be him because women wanted him. And women wanted him because he had charisma. And because of that, Elvis single-handedly made the primary requirement for basically all true rock stars going forward was to be cool, because Elvis was cool. If nothing else, I mean, that was really the big thing about rock and roll. It always has been, is being cool. That's why, if you hear people my age or even younger, anybody who grew up with rock and roll complaining about the 90s and early 2000s rock music, was that it was getting Disneyfied. You were seeing shows on Disney where they're playing plastic guitars or pretending to play real guitars, and that was not cool. 8-year-olds are not cool playing rock and roll. They're cute, and that's not the same thing. But yeah, being cool, it's... he looked cool. He was very shy and kind of meek looking, but he had, he just exuded confidence, and with the slight cockiness. Well, maybe not slight, maybe a lot of cockiness, but he had moves that made the girls drip with desire, and that was something that people weren't ready for. So where Chuck Berry pioneered the duck walk, Elvis pioneered the rubber legs in 1954. That's basically when he started playing and touring and doing. In 1955, he had his early records was "It's All Right." That one was not played on country and western stations because it sounded too black. "Blue Moon of Kentucky" wasn't played on R&B station because it sounded like a hillbilly. He was having a hard time getting airtime, as it were, because like I said, it was a prejudiced time, and that included radio. You had radio that was mostly for white audiences. You had radio that was mostly for black audience. In the South, it was the white audiences were mostly country and western fans. So breaking that barrier was tough. So he went on TV and did it. In 1956, he had his first hit single, "Heartbreak Hotel," went #1. And within a year, it sold 10 million copies. Elvis went on to sell over 500 million records worldwide, more gold and platinum records than on the Billboard Top 200 than anybody else. Let me clarify that by saying rock and roll, because it may be, you can double check and crucify me in the comments, but I don't think any modern artists have anywhere close to that. But if they do, they're not rock and roll, and you know it. So also in 1956, RCA Victor bought the Sun contract where Elvis had been recording. The same Sun Records was putting out a lot of the early rock and roll, including Jerry Lee Lewis, who was kind of a competitor of Elvis, but they were also they also played together, or at least practiced together. They weren't, there was no animosity or anything, but lots of other really famous people at the time. And so anyway, when they bought the contract, I think it was after that he put out his first album, self-titled album, Elvis Presley, and it was the first rock and roll album to ever hit the top of the Billboard charts. That means something. So like I said, Elvis kind of introduced himself on TV to most of America, because like I said, there was no satellite radio or anything like that. If you played on the radio, it was very local. It was unlikely that you would get, until you became a big star, to get a record played on NBC radio across the country, for instance. So Presley's second Milton Berle show appearance was at NBC's Hollywood studio, and he was in the middle of another hectic tour, but Milton Berle persuaded Presley to leave his guitar backstage, and during the performance, Elvis abruptly halted his up-tempo rendition of Hound Dog and launched into a slow, grinding, accentuated with dance moves with, very exaggerated body movements. And this was the performance. This was the video. that created a storm of controversy. Jack Gould of the New York Times wrote at the time, Mr. Presley has no discernible singing ability. His phrasing, if it can be called that, consists of stereotyped variations that go with a beginner's aria in a bathtub. His one specialty is an accented movement of the body, primarily identified with the repertoire of the blonde bombshells of the burlesque runway. On NBC's The Steve Allen Show in New York, Allen, no fan of rock and roll, introduced a new Elvis in a white bow tie and black tails. Elvis sang Hound Dog for less than a minute to a basset hound wearing a top hat and bow tie. This was meant by Steve Allen to kind of be humiliating and demeaning to rock and roll in general, but Elvis in particular. And but as described by television historian Jake Austin, Allen thought Presley was talentless and absurd, and he set things up so Presley would show his contrition. But Allen's show with Presley had, for the first time, beaten the Ed Sullivan Show in the ratings. So Ed Sullivan booked Presley for 3 appearances for an unprecedented $50,000. The first, on September 9th, 1956, was seen by approximately 60 million viewers, and that's a record 82.6% of the television audience. After a show in La Crosse, Wisconsin, I mean, this is just to give you an idea of the absurdity of people at the time. And when I hear so much about people wanting to cancel this and cancel that because they say something you don't like, whether it's right or left side is coming from, it happens on both. It makes me think of things like this of the 50s when they really did censor you. They didn't call it canceling. They just censored you. They wouldn't sell, your albums. They wouldn't even record your albums or whatever other horrible things they might think of to harm somebody that said something they didn't like. After this particular show in La Crosse, Wisconsin, an urgent message on the letterhead of the local Catholic diocese's newspaper was sent to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. It warned that Presley is in definite danger to the security of the United States. His actions and motions were such as to rouse the sexual passions of teenage youth. After the show, more than 1,000 teenagers tried to gang into Presley's room at the auditorium. Indications of the harm Presley did just in La Crosse were the 2 high school girls whose abdomen and thigh had Presley's autograph. Now you know the history, at least the controversy, and why the fact that he brought it together. He basically made it okay for white folks on the radio or in watching TV to listen to black music, and that opened up everything to all the black musicians who, let's face it, they invented rock and roll. In fact, when people say, mention a band that, it's a black rock and roll band, it's like, no, it's a rock and roll band. If you're going to quantify something, you need to quantify the other rock and roll bands as white rock and roll bands, because it was invented by black folks and exploited by whites. But it's all rock and roll to me, and I love it. So 1958 to 1960, Elvis went into the Army. He was drafted. A lot of people were drafted back then. You had to sign up back then. But even in the 2 years that he was in the Army, he had 10 top 40 hits. It's hard to do that. When he got out in 1960, for the next 8 years, he focused on films. These films were cheesy. They were poorly written, badly acted. He had a few hits out of it. I mean, the man couldn't release a record without it hitting the charts. It may not hit number 1 in the 60s, but it was hitting the charts. And until the Beatles came along, he really had no serious competition, even though he wasn't recording records at the time. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with the Stones. I mean, again, he was an album musician. I mean, he had albums, like I said, that went to the top of the charts, but it wasn't album rock per se. It was singles put into an album format. So the singles that you may want to look at or listen to if you want a good grounding in Elvis's music, or if you're a reactor, I mean, you might need a list, because if you're starting with 50s music, there may be a lot of your listeners who aren't familiar enough with it. So let's give you a list of some songs to look at or listen to. That's All Right, Don't Be Cruel, Hound Dog, big one, as already mentioned. Blue Suede Shoes, old Carl Perkins song. Lots of people recorded it. Elvis made the most money with it. Blue Moon of Kentucky, as I briefly mentioned before. Heartbreak Hotel, also one of his first song, and huge hit. Love Me Tender, first ballad, and it again made the girls weak in the knees and moist everywhere. All Shook Up, another higher energy song than Love Me Tender. Let Me Be Your Teddy Bear, another lovey-dovey song that the girls just went crazy over. And let's see, Shake, Rattle, and Roll. I think that was a Bill Haley and the Comets song. I'm not positive. Jailhouse Rock. This has a good video. If you're looking for videos of him playing, it was a stage thing. I think it was from a TV show, but it's pretty easy to find online. It's Now or Never. Tutti Frutti, Little Richard song. Little Richard was one of them that had a problem with him claiming the title of King of Rock and Roll. But, it is what it was. Return to Sender. Long Tall Sally. That song has been copied or played by so many people. You'll have to look who wrote it. It wasn't Elvis. Elvis was not a musician per se. He was a singer, and that is a musical instrument, but he wasn't a real professional musician in the classic sense. So he didn't write his songs, is what I'm saying. Long Tall Sally, and Can't Help Falling in Love, another ballad type song. And that's a short list. Like I said, he had so many songs that were hits. It's like I said, it seemed like everything he put out was a hit, or whether it was a minor hit or a number one hit. So if you're looking for his live stuff, there's a lot of TV footage that you can find now. Getting it on your channel, if you're a reactor, may be a little more difficult. The way I get away with it personally is I slow down the video a little bit, because I'm not playing the music, and you can't get away with that if you're doing a reaction, obviously. So there is early TV stuff. Look for the Steve Allen Show. Like I said, there's some weird moments there. Ed Sullivan Show, as I mentioned as well. But there's other things. There are some concert footage. Most of it is poor quality. We're still talking about the late 50s, and they weren't shooting videos like they do now, or even in the 60s and 70s. So don't look for huge, great quality. Now, he did have a 1968 comeback special when he was kind of moving out of the films and getting back into doing performances, stage performances. I believe you can find some of that on YouTube. I don't know whether it's cut up into songs for your reactions. Aloha from Hawaii, done in I think it was January 1973. That was a special event. It was satellite broadcast in 1973, when when satellite broadcast was very, very new. It was broadcast worldwide, all over the world, on network TV. So, it was free. It wasn't pay-per-view or anything. Everybody got to sit in their home and watch Elvis. Most of us for the first time. I remember as an 8-year-old, or 12-year-old, sitting at home and watching that. Not because I was particularly a huge Elvis fan even then, but because it was historic. You didn't get to see that. So it's interesting. It's an interesting show to watch. Live in Las Vegas is another concert that you can get clips of, I believe. If you can't, watch the whole show. Go through the parts that bore you, because there might be some of that. But his stage presence and everything was very entertaining. That's why he lasted as long as he did. So anyway, next time we're going to talk about Deep Purple. Deep Purple is one of the 3 bands who invented heavy metal. I can't wait for you to see me again. And so until then, let the good times roll.